Well, it's that time, so turn it on and turn it up. This is episode 1 of Texas World Language Radio, the inaugural episode. Hello, everyone. My name is James Ayers, Frisco ISD World Language Coordinator. Joining me on this adventure and providing us with a voice of reason, my co-host and Region 10 World Language Master Consultant, Dr. Meredith Clark. Dr. Clark, how are you today?
Doing great. Hope you are, James.
Doing excellent. I'm really excited to be here. This podcast, we're hoping, will serve as an opportunity to provide language teachers and administrators and coordinators across the state with information that will not only increase understanding, but maybe inform some decisions that are made in the classroom, at a campus level, and into the district level, and maybe, who knows, even at a state level. So we're excited and thrilled to see where this goes.
And, our purpose is to make information accessible so we can move the needle on student language proficiency in the state of Texas. And what a better place to start with than the TEKS. And so speaking of our TEKS, our Standards for World Language Education, we have a very special guest with us here today. Greta Lundgaard was the World Language Coordinator in Louisville ISD from 2001 to 2004, and in Plano ISD from 2004 to 2016. Officially, she retired from the district. However, she remains extremely active in our field. She consults with districts in Texas and across the U.S. She provides learning at the Texas Foreign Language Association and the Texas Association for Language Supervision, and also with ACTFL and StarTalk. She was National District Supervisor of the Year, and we are thrilled to have her as our first guest on our inaugural episode. Greta, tell us a little bit about what you're up to now.
Well, thank you, Meredith and James. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm just busy working with folks, still working with teachers. And I'll say the kind of emphasis that I think is coming around right now is a little bit on instructional coaching and feedback. I've been doing that for several districts here in Texas and outside of Texas. And it's kind of like more personalized learning in the sense of teachers setting their goals for what they want to do. I'm working with one district on literacy. So it's all about teaching reading in the classroom. So it's setting their own goals. What do you want feedback on? And then others just on, wow, how can I improve my instruction? How can I, keep my target language there? What am I doing? And so I've been doing that both through Zoom, but, nothing beats out just sitting in the classroom of a teacher for 30, 45 minutes and then meeting afterwards to talk about it. And then, of course, I'm still a big believer that proficiency is possible, even when we have students for 2 years. It's the quality of what we do and how we focus on it. So I'm still out there pushing this idea of communicative language teaching and putting social justice themes, cultural themes, all those other themes within the context of real world communication. And what that looks like for novice learners versus intermediate learners, right? We want stuff that can transfer beyond one lesson or 1 week of lessons into a real world context. So I'm still really pumped up and focused on that and trying to push that out as much as I can.
Yeah, I mean, once you grab onto that passion of believing that proficiency is possible, it's really hard to just set that aside. So, it's really a driver for so many of us in our profession. And you've played such a key role in world language education in Texas and on the national stage. And as James and I were hatching out ideas for this podcast, we considered what information would be key for every world language teacher in Texas. And naturally, we landed on the LOTE TEKS, which provide learning goals for every single student and teacher. So considering the TEKS were developed almost a decade ago, many world language educators don't know who wrote them or how they were created. So before we dive into the content of the TEKS, Greta, can you tell us a little bit about that TEKS revision process and who was involved and what was your role?
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, it kind of started as anything with TEA, kind of a year or so, year and a half in advance. And so at that point, so we're thinking 2011, 12, okay, 13
Okay.
perhaps, things
Mhm.
were really kind of in flux. We had lost some influence at TEA, went from a really strong presence to more of a supporting role, and then it became a halftime position, and then it became, sit in the office, answer the phones. Sorry, I don't want to be politically incorrect, but those things have to happen, but kind of restricted to that. So we were in flux. The changes at TEA impacted instruction. LIL had not happened yet. So the idea of grassroots leadership, or we were still kind of a top down. In fact, the whole world language world in the United States was a top down model. And but things were kind of bubbling up within the United States in foreign language teaching, and we all kind of felt this impetus that we have to catch up with it. And so TEA, I must have been about 2012, maybe 13, kind of sent out their little invitation. And it went to school districts, went to the list of coordinators, and then it was shared, asking folks to apply to be on the TEKS revision committee. And, as a TALS member, a TEFLA member, we were thrilled because we've really been lobbying for this for a while.
So world language teachers and supervisors wrote the TEKS. It wasn't some aliens from the Texas Education Agency, right?
Well, I would say there were the usual suspects.
Okay.
And you can't blame TEA in a way because they're in Austin, right? And they have this big educational institution close by, and then several others also very close by. So typically, and I actually did work on the educator standards, which was kind of in 2010. I even worked on the educator standards, and I will say that 95% of the folks that worked on the educator standards were university folks, which is good, but it would have been nice if, I think me and MK McChristian, who was the coordinator at Richardson ISD, she and I were the only representatives from actual places where K-12 teaching happened. Let me just say that. So they tended to go really heavy on university folks. And so we were thrilled but then they almost went all the way to the other side, wanting only teachers. And that is a great idea. But at the same time, most teachers, even at that point, were teaching 2 or 3 preps. It was just teachers in the sense of having the capacity to kind of dig into national standards, what's happening in other states. That capacity wasn't really quite there. And so it would be great, we thought, if we could have, and this is TALS talking, the Texas Association for Language Supervision, if we could have more of a 50-50 split in terms of folks who had an obligation to lead districts for curriculum and instruction and assessment versus those in the classroom, hands-on, boots on the ground. And I think I referred a little bit to that. This was kind of, TALS and TEFLA were pushing for revision because things had happened nationally. The original set, and I went back and I found my original set of the TEKS, which were lovely. But if you look at them, well, one thing we were not happy with was the separation in the previous set of TEKS for LOTE into communication, comparisons, cultures, connections, and communities. And so what was tending to happen in the classroom, and even the textbooks, of course, encouraged this at the time, was just kind of really separation. So we had Culture Day, cultural capsules, Culture Days on Fridays usually. Then we had Comparisons Day, and that was the code for grammar. Here's our grammar day. And really connections didn't really happen. The connection was, let's learn the numbers by doing multiplication or addition in the target language. That was the math connection.
Okay.
And communities, honestly, was limited to things that National Honor Societies would do, go out to farmers market, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Connections, because again, we were pre-Zoom, pre all of this. And so
Yep.
connections really weren't happening at all, but they were kind of thrown in there to justify whatever the teacher really wanted to do. And in the larger world language world, things were moving. And I'll bring up some dates for those who really like to see, because this was a process. Again, it wasn't like we just woke up one day and go, let's just change everything. So about 2007, and I'll go all the way back to that.
Okay.
The National Council of State Supervisors, this is NACESFL, working with the Center for Applied Language Studies, this is CASTLE, both of these entities still around, at University of Oregon, they developed LinguaFolio. So we're going way back in the archives, but LinguaFolio.
Wow.
And LinguaFolio.
It was that long ago? It was 2007?
That long ago, 2007. Okay. And LinguaFolio was based on the European Common Scale, because the European Proficiency Scale is much more like the, the Foreign Service. So it's a 1, 2, 3, 4 type of a thing, 4A, right. 4B. And so they had, because in Europe, right, obviously we've got crossover between country, European Union had happened. We got people living in Germany, working in Belgium. So they had to have a way to quantify language proficiency based on the real world, right? Nobody tested you on, have you read Don Quixote? Or did you know the Day of the Dead, traditions? Nobody, it was all real world. And so right. NACESFL began working with the European Council, and Castles was hired to create this document, LinguaFolio. And it was, wow. It was so out there that people didn't know how to use it, because wow, it had progress indicators at grades 4, 8, 12, and 16. And they focused on what students could do with the language. Like they used words like explain, ask and answer questions. Whereas our TEKS for Load, when it came to communication, we just used the word engage, right. Engage in conversations, engage or present. Like what does,
Yeah, the functionality was really, the language functions weren't there.
Wasn't there. So that developed into the ACTFL NACESFL can-do statements, which debuted at ACTFL in 2013, if you can believe that. So
right. And I think the performance descriptors were published in 2012. So and I think this is as a result of the work with LinguaFolio. Like, okay, you have to have impetus to change something. Because as they were working on LinguaFolio, they were like, oh, wow. So these standards, the world readiness standards, as they're called now, also needed to be updated. And that was another big change, because our TEKS for Load at the time in Texas were based on the old version. And I want to say 1998, 99, I'm not even sure when that old version, and they were called the national standards. They changed to world readiness standards. And the two biggest changes were at interpretive mode, which now students were asked to analyze what they hear, which means actively work with. And the biggest other change was culture, because it changed and the whole perspective flipped from teachers offering these opportunities to students to learners will. Learners will do these things, and culture, learners will explore and examine culture in the target language versus the teacher picking and choosing and interpreting or paraphrasing these things for the students. So we really needed to move forward, because our TEKS, as they were, besides other things, were really not indicative of what was happening nationwide. Right.
It sounds like you got to this point where the timing was pretty good. You had all these things that had been going on for years previous. And I'm really curious, because we, when Dr. Clark and I started to talk about this episode, inevitably we pulled out the TEKS and started looking at the language. And, some of these things you mentioned, there's some real intentionality and real focus on some of these ideas that you thought. I'm gonna pull a phrase here from the TEKS that I really hope we could focus on for a bit, and it's in the introduction there where it starts off saying the study of world languages is an essential part of education. And in 21st century language classrooms, students gain an understanding of two basic aspects of human existence. And so I'm really interested to hear how you guys came up with these two things here, because I think this seems really to drive everything now. So the phrase was nature of communication and complexity of culture. So how did those two, and it sounds like based on everything that was going on, I can maybe see where we're going, but how did you guys arrive at those two things?
And this was such a great question. I had to sit there and go, oh my gosh, because it was done in committee. We had the TEKS committee 1 through 4. Then ASL was a separate committee. Latin was a separate committee. And then the APIB, level 4, 5, 6, 7, etc., was a separate committee. And so here we are in this, I was in the TEKS 1 through 4 group. And so I had to start thinking, wow, what were we talking about? How did we get there? So here's kind of what I'm dredging up. So this whole idea of nature of communication, and you're exactly right. All of these things that were kind of bubbling up in the other part of our world language world were kind of coming to the fore. And I think all of us, even the coordinators, we have a teaching experience. And I just remember as a German teacher looking at the TEKS Verlauf and saying, I'm not sure how this helps me. I'm not sure how this helps me know what to do. Engage in, to socialize, provide, it's like, okay, so this engaging. So I think to myself, so the nature of communication, the first thing was for a purpose. For a purpose. And that turns out to be one of, wow, how did we land on that? But then it was almost like, what are we doing right now? We're having a conversation. Why? Not just to say, okay, these look good to me, let's go on. But our purpose was defined for us. From my perspective, I want these to be usable. I want these as a classroom teacher. If I don't have a Greta, or I don't have a James, I don't have a Marita, I don't have a coordinator, how do I know that I'm meeting the state standards? I'm a rule follower, right? So I always tell folks, when you signed your contract, your teaching contract, you promised, you're obligated to teach to the state standards. And now what does that even mean if these mean nothing to me? So for a purpose, what is the purpose? I was teaching them German. What do I want them to do? So we kind of tossed that around and we came up with real world purposes. Because another thing, again, that kind of came into play, James, to your point, that timing was great, was in 2008, the 9th graders of 2008, statewide now, we're going to have 2 years of world language to graduate. None of y'all remember what it was like teaching before 2008. Teaching before 2008, as a German teacher, I taught everybody who's going to college. I taught everybody who already know how to take notes, already knew how to study. I didn't, rarely, you know what I'm saying? I had a certain group of kids. Now, I'd have 1 or 2 or 3 kids that weren't in that group, but they weren't enough to, they just got with the program, right? Oh, all of a sudden, 9th graders, we've got everyone. And these were the kids that were seniors in 2012, which meant they had to have passed 2 years of a world language. And so we were looking at that coming down the pike. And it was like, oh my gosh, these standards don't tell us what to do. So real world, meaning we know we got these kids for 2 years. They're not going to major in Spanish, French, German, ASL. Maybe they'll work in ASL, but they're not going to do it. So teaching for college, teaching with that as our end goal, or teaching with AP as an end goal, while that's lovely, our kids are not going to, you look at attrition rates, even from 2 to 3. No, kids, and there's nothing wrong with saying, I have to take these 2 years of German because I have to have these graduate. There's nothing wrong with that. But my idea was, so let's make them as proficient as we can. And they don't need to discuss paintings. They don't need to know the life story of Frida Kahlo, lovely as she is, right? They don't necessarily, it's not necessarily age appropriate for me to teach them about Oktoberfest and what happens there, because it's just not. So what do they need to know? If they're going over there with their parents or they're doing whatever, what do they need to know? So now we got to real world. And then we started thinking, well, but it's not all just interpersonal. What is it? Well, then it's for different audiences. If my student is writing a letter, because again, we're talking about old style text that we want, a letter to the principal needs to be a formal letter. Email was just coming on, texting was out of the, it's way too expensive to text, right? So, so this informalness. So then for different audiences, and also looking at the 2012, I had an advanced copy. So in terms of TALS, we were talking about what's going to happen with the world readiness standards. And that also became a big deal. So I would say purposeful, real world, and mainly because we're focusing on the non-AP test takers, because we were all stuck in this historical events, like for level 4 non-AP. Historical events, right? A political thing. It was all thematically things that most on-level kids were not really interested. They wanted to learn about food. They wanted to learn about culture. They wanted to learn about the history of touristy places, right? Not the history of a war, right? Maybe if they did painting, they wanted to look, here's 3 paintings of that same thing that Goya did, whatever in Spain, the 1802 shooting thing. I can't remember the title of it, but they want, here's 3 different artists painting the same event. What can, as seniors, right? What can you tell the artist saw based on what he painted?
I'm just curious, like did you come up with a working definition of communication at this point, or was that just something that you knew, like you had this purpose and communication was going to fill that, but did you have a really good definition of that?
We didn't at that point, because we were just kind of getting down to, so we started with what is, we did a pro-con kind of a thing, or strengths, strengths or a force field analysis, what is good, what is bad about what we had. And so we didn't get to that. It was just, this was the brainstorm. What do we want our TEKS to reflect? What do we want them to do? And as a coordinator, working within a district where I was involved with other coordinators and other content areas, I know that not all districts are world language coordinators at the same table with the other content areas. But by that time, I had been Plano for a while, and I was very much embedded with what was going on in the other content areas through their coordinators. It's very tight. I met with them, was part. And the thing I saw that they had that we didn't, that helped teachers, whether they liked it or not, was the student expectation in their TEKS. Right? Because they would have conversations about their TEKS, their state tests. And I was looking at the English standards, the science standards, the history standards. And I'm going, they have student expectations, meaning the student expectations in their TEKS were what were on their state tests, not the, present tense of tener, right? Yeah. It was, sorry, and I'm using Spanish for everyone who's listening. I can do it in French and German, but I can't code switch between the two. So I got to just pick one. So, wow, I was like, okay, because I'm thinking to myself again, based on TALS conversations, TEFL conversations, what about, there were 40 coordinators, LUT coordinators in the state at that time, maybe. And we had 120 school districts. 1,200 school districts. So what the heck? What am I supposed to do out in Level Land, out in Wolfforth and Post, right? I don't know. So I wanted student expectations. I'll just say I did, because I saw that as something teachers could hang their hats on when they looked at the TEKS and said, what am I supposed to teach? Mm-hmm. Yeah, what am my students be able to do? Mm-hmm.
And I think, I go out and I work with a lot of different school districts in Region 10, and so many people say, oh, our TEKS are so vague. They're so subjective. I hear it all the time. And I'm like, but if you look at these student expectations, you can measure whether a kid can ask and answer questions about everyday life. I mean, that is an observable phenomenon, right? Like, you know, when you have an OPI, oral proficiency interview with ACTFL, you know, they observe the language that you're able to use, your function amongst all the other domains of language performance, and they're able to provide you a proficiency rating. So, you know, these student expectations are not vague, but I still feel like that cloud of vagueness like follows people's perception of the TEKS. So that's going to push us into kind of our next piece here, which is, you know, how does this understanding that our goals are to understand human existence better by understanding and being able to communicate and participate in the target culture. So as a district coordinator, how did you help your teachers understand the essential aspects of communication and culture? And what does that look like in the classroom?
That's a great question. And, you know, the idea, I'll just say one thing because I can't help it, about the broadness or the vagueness. And well, they are right in a sense, because we don't define, the TEKS do not define vocabulary. The TEKS do not define topic. The TEKS do not define grammar. So my personal feel when teachers do that, it's like the TEKS is also not a textbook, because districts,
it's not a checklist.
It's not a checklist. You have to look at what your client base wants, which is your parents. If you feel like you need to refer to a textbook, then you've got vocabulary, grammar in there. But I think that is where that vagueness comes. And that was also a very specific conversation that we had, because some folks, and if you look at the TEKS for ASL, for example, those are very specific in terms of content.
Was there any thought to being specific with content in world languages at a point, or how did that go?
Oh yeah, there was a camp. We had camps, you know, but it was discussion, and it was a good discussion. And, you know, that would involve, to me, if we specified topics, themes, grammar at this level, blah, 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 we have a state curriculum. And no district that I know in the state of Texas has allowed TEA to have that much influence. Now, the math and social math and science TEKS are real specific, but that's because their content is different from ours, right? I would say English language arts and LOT or world languages are more alike, because they are over course of time. And what we've got to realize is, what I always tell folks, is that these kids have taken English, math, social studies, and science since first grade. So they have all this background knowledge that allows their secondary state standards, their secondary TEKS, to be specific, because they learned how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. In elementary school, they learned how to read, they learned how to write, they learned how to do all that. We're starting basically not from first grade, perhaps, because our kids do have background knowledge, but we're starting later in the process. So ours are more conceptual and proficiency based. So, however, going back to this, go ahead.
Yeah, and so Texas is about local control, right?
Yes.
So districts have local control, and I think one of the reasons that why I appreciate the context isn't specified in the TEKS, other than everyday life or about and beyond everyday life, which are the two phrases that hit on context.
And those are the ones in the proficiency guidelines. So those are not made up either, right? It's all based on something. Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, I remember somebody told me a story once about they used a curriculum that was produced in Tennessee, and they were using it. And there was a unit titled Southern Comfort, and it was about Southern comfort food, you know? And so I appreciate the fact that our TEKS allow for local control, because what kids in Brownsville are interested in is not necessarily the same content that kids in Plano ISD are interested in, right? So
everyday life is different.
Everyday life is different for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
So given that, like following up to the second part of the question, no, we're having a great conversation here. What, how did you help people understand what communication and culture look like in the classroom with these new TEKS?
That was great. These are just great questions. And so I appreciate the fact y'all are getting my brain working this morning. I think it's really tied in with this idea of culture, okay? Because I just worked with a teacher who we had the same conversation. So I'm going to just tell this story and then use that as an analogy to what the difference is between what we had before, what we were trying to go to before versus what we have now. So talking with the teacher and level 1 teacher, and he is, it's talking about, very beginning activities I like to do. Okay. Free time activities, very common, very everyday life. But also, I'm going to go to your point, one that varies depending on where you live in our state. So it's a perfect example, right? So anyway, here we are, DFW area activities, and we're talking about cognitive load, specifically cognitive overload. And sure, we could write a list for 30 activities. So we're kind of going through that whole spiel about, well, how many activities do you really need? How about making sure the activity that the kids in your class actually do are on the list, because you'll automatically have diversity. Some will like, some will not like. So that was the conversation, kind of like keeping that obligatory vocabulary concise and doable. And so the teacher was a veteran teacher, said very appropriately, well, how do I know then that I'm exposing them or teaching? He didn't say exposing, but teaching them the words that they need to know about activities. And so here we then had to have this conversation. Look at the larger goal. You're seeing a tree in a forest. The tree is activities, but the forest is, how do I, as the TEKS say, state and support my opinion? It's not that you're teaching them to say, I like soccer, I don't like football, that's not what you're teaching them. This is step 1 in the student's journey of being able to state and support an opinion in different ways. And that for this teacher was like an aha moment. It doesn't matter that you only have 10 activities because you're not assessing them other than maybe a vocab check. Do you know enough words to have a conversation? Do you know enough words to read this little article? You are assessing them on their ability to say what they like and don't like, because now you're going to add why. And then you're going to give them a list of things and ask their preference. Right? And then you're going to have them read an article about activities and they're going to state their opinion. Would you like to be in this athlete's shoes? Why or why not? So that began the conversation. That is what real world communication is, not just the tree. I can do the tree. Yeah. And we do have to start with the tree. Don't get me wrong. I'm very practical. Yes, you got to start with the tree. But what you're going to do over time in that level 1 class is now you're going to talk about maybe school subjects you like and don't like. And you're going to say, now my favorite subject, you wouldn't say, you could say your favorite, but we don't want to add all of those ways to express your preference all at once. So by the end of the semester or the end of level 1, you have students now that have 5 different ways to express their preferences and to give their opinion, and they can at least give me a simple statement because, or another statement, I like football, I like to tackle people, that kind of stuff. So it began with that, and culture is the same way. To me, why would I've got a large set of Spanish teachers in my district. They all, or a lot of them, come from different backgrounds. Some come from Mexican backgrounds, some from Puerto Rican backgrounds, Colombian, Guatemalan, blah, blah, blah. Why would I, within my curriculum, want to say, in this unit, we're going to talk about the chicken buses? Is that it? What is it? The chicken things in Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
Well, I've got a teacher who is a second generation from Guatemala. Why would I impose that culture, right? It's not about the specific Hispanic country, because what we're doing is building a forest of culture, not one tree of culture. And so we want students to begin to appreciate any different culture. And I know in Texas, typically we go with Mexican culture, and that's fine, that's great. But not all of my teachers, I've got some from Panama. And so, you know what I'm saying? And so to me, it's freedom for a teacher to focus on what he or she knows best. Even our non-native speaker teachers have, maybe most of them have spent significant time in places like Peru, right? And so, because it's not just the historical, the legacy, the traditional culture. And honestly, at level 1, those are social studies concepts. At level 2, social studies concepts. But what students, the real world they need to know is, wow, why are German refrigerators so small? Why do they have open air? What's the point? See, that's the product, open air markets, right?
Yeah,
But,
I'll bring it back to something you mentioned earlier, Greta. I really liked when we talked about where you guys were landing with this as a committee. It's, you really wanted to find that purpose, and to define the purpose as being communication, and then culture coming in on the backside of that, and then using all the supporting documents and the supporting things that had come out through all these organizations in that time frame, which is again, it kind of boggles my mind that the timing of this was so maybe serendipitous. But understanding that this is the purpose we want for our kids. It wasn't the 5 C's. It's communication, and we want to be able to do it at this level. So I think looking back now, we've had this for almost 10 years now. We're coming up on that, at least in the process that was 10 years ago that you guys were going through this. How has this impacted? How have these TEKS impacted what we've done in the state? You've seen this now at a variety of different levels.
I have. And yeah, that is a great question too, because I have been fortunate enough to work with folks across the state. And I think that there are, just like anything else, there's diversity. I see districts that have really grabbed a hold of this because they do see, wow, this makes my life easier in a way. I mean, well, it does. It makes my life easier. So those student expectations, I can add content and be selective with them. And now I've got the formative assessments or the performance assessment for this unit, right? So it's kind of like our friend Thomas Zauer said a long time ago, I take a can-do statement, I can give my opinion. So I add content, I can give my opinion about the Olympics. And then I add text type, right, which are also in the can-do statements. We have them also in our TEKS for Low and the student expectation. So now I have the vocabulary I need, the grammar I need, and then what I want the output to look like, right? I need
at that level of expectation.
At that level of expectations. I also know now what's above that level of expectation. So if I'm forming my own rubric, I have my 3 column, which is the expectation. And then, wow, this student actually had a couple of connected sentences in his or her response or their response. So now I do have, right? And I can give feedback to that person who actually gave me, I can support my opinion with statements. Okay, what's your next step? Well, how about 2 or 3 statements? How about elaborating on that statement? How about giving me a more of a, so in my mind, and maybe I'm oversimplifying, but I think those student expectations and how they progress the progression from novice, from level 1 to up, gives me feedback opportunities, right? Without having to search around and give feedback on spelling or give feedback on gender or give feedback on adjective endings, which again, most students really, that's an intermediate skill. If we go back to look at the proficiency descriptors and the proficiency guidelines, and that's something but how I've seen it. So I've seen districts able to, especially large districts who want people to have some consistency over campuses. I have seen some individual school districts that are smaller who don't have a coordinator. Sherman ISD is a good example. What's the other one? Georgetown ISD, for an example, who have the campuses themselves now can collaborate based on the TEKS for level. And nothing's perfect, right? There's always room for growth. But to me, grabbing onto the student expectations is the most straightforward piece of it if I don't have time. And so I have seen that. At the same time, I have seen legacy practice. And, we've all seen folks pushing back on, what they've always done. I think that's a matter of a couple of things. If there's no guidance, I think teachers really want to make sure they're doing the right thing for their students, right? Mm-hmm. And they're not afraid, but they're hesitant or leery because what they're doing is working for them, right? And they're afraid of kind of falling back. Nobody wants to be a first-year teacher again.
Right.
So, tough. I mean, Meredith, and you probably have in our immediate area have more experience with that. So this might be a good question for you.
Yeah. So, that map of the world at night, maybe you all have seen it, and you see all of the lights, from the electricity, and the parts of the earth that are not illuminated are pitch black. Yeah. And I find that access to information about world language education, the purpose of world language education being communication, which states very clearly first sentence in section number 2. Mm-hmm. It's like a map of the earth at night. And we do have districts throughout our state that are really asking students to perform those student expectations in the TEKS. If they're asking them to perform the student expectations in the TEKS, then we have proof that we've moved the needle on student performance. And if we prove, and when students see that success builds upon itself, right? So now we prove our worth as a discipline. Students are able to communicate in the target language. They go better, go farther, do better. And we have proof of that. But there's also a lot of areas like just, when I started at Region 10 in 2017, I went to, some districts in the region very close to these Metroplex districts that have written curriculum for the student expectations, and they were unaware that the standards had even changed. Mm. And so when you mentioned legacy practice, I think, and just to clarify, like legacy practice refers to kind of the traditional practice of teaching the vocabulary, teaching the grammar, and then putting them together and, to make sentences and things like that. Yeah. So, there's folks that are hanging on to that practice because they simply just don't have the information they need. And teaching language is complex, right? So there's a lot of factors involved. And so, leading into our next question, which is looking ahead, what work still needs to be done so that every world language student receives instruction that helps them perform the TEKS and communicate? And
I think number one, and I know again, TALS and TEFLA have been lobbying for this a lot and have with varying degrees of success to have a LOT person or world language person at TEA. In the past, when we had a little bit more presence, at one point we even had 3 people working at the state office on world languages. There were communications. Oh yes, we had 3 people. Wow. That was even when I was still around, still alive and teaching in the classroom. But so I think, when they talk about having someone to answer phones, I also think there needs to be someone to actually call on the phones. I mean, in the past, things would come out from the world language person at TEA to superintendents, to the superintendent address. Note, here's the announcement. And it would go to the superintendent, to the assistant sup for curriculum instruction. This is what's coming up. This is what's, and I'm not sure that those kinds of communications are happening for districts that do not have a world language coordinator, because TALS does a good job of keeping everybody in line. So I think that should happen. I know there's a communications list of every district in the state who's in charge, right? And so it's just a matter of fact of getting world language pertinent communications to those people from someone in TEA that would make them forward it to the principal or whatever. So there's that. One of the things that has impacted the ability for these to filter down has been, it has been, I don't want to, again, be politically incorrect, but, recently, or in the recent past, we've changed the way that instructional materials money has been dispersed. And so one of my ways of thinking is that instructional materials money is now managed at district level in a different way that doesn't necessarily assure that that money is equitably distributed among all content areas in the things they need. So that person or whoever's in charge of that may be looking at things for a very traditional lens. We're also hamstrung a little bit, and I'm talking about instructional materials. We're hamstrung a little bit in the sense that I think in the past, I'm not sure if it's still there, but that there was something in administrative code that all students were to be provided textbooks. So if a world language department, for example, said, we don't want a textbook series, but we want access to extempore, or we want access to the Avant materials, we want access to these materials. They are not TEA approved.
Right.
Yeah.
So those are difficult to get, but those things keep teachers inside of a book because they can't, anything then, if I want to do anything else, I've got to pay for it on my own. Right? If I want, or it has to be free, or it has to be one of those things like Go Formative, or what's the one? I don't know, the one that's my least favorite, which makes students butt up against each other. And wow, I can knock you out, James, from having to, and I'm like, oh my gosh, why are we being competitive about learning language in a way that makes some people not get up anyway, whatever that one is. Right. So that might be because that is not an instructional material. That's a technology application. Right. So we have this idea that instructional materials are different from technology applications, where really, in a sense, now they are becoming one and the same, right? So there's that. The other thing is Title II money in our state. Title II, as defined by the Federal Department of Education, can be applied to foreign language. It is right there with math, with reading, with English language arts. World languages are there. Yep. For professional development, for book studies, there's a long list of things that world language folks could do with. Wouldn't we be happy to have $10,000 a year, right? We don't need the hundreds of thousands of dollars a year that math and English and reading get. Right. We'd be happy with 10, 15. So there are a lot of things that are happening at district level that are not helping. Right. That are not helping. Yeah. So
some of these practices, maybe were created with, good intentions, but actually have adverse effects and create inequities between different areas of study within districts and how those monies are allocated.
I think it points to the fact, right, that there's still a lot at every level here that is needing to be done. In my perception, these last 10 years, teachers have really had to increase their understanding of what the TEKS are asking, and teachers have been a lot of the ones that have been driving curriculums, at least in larger districts, right, and creating curriculums that define content and that direction that they want to go with the culture and content piece. And that's been great. And I think we're starting to, at least in some of these larger districts that I've been a part of, that's starting to happen. You're seeing these curriculums that are really focused on communication in different areas. And Dr. Clark, I'd be interested to hear just kind of what you see on a regional level, maybe what that looks like from smaller districts. You mentioned kind of the light map there, and I'm sure smaller districts, that's still kind of a struggle. And then to hear your perspective, Greta, on, even at the state level, we still need a lot of support coming from the big agencies that support education there.
Definitely. I think that I think curriculum directors in smaller districts that don't have a world languages coordinator are coming to the realization that it's not okay to put the world language teachers with the PE teachers on PE day. And so I do see a lot of, people kind of tuning in and starting to reach out and ask for help. And within the ESC network, we have other consultants that work at other service centers across the state, and they may not have the sole title of LOT or world languages consultant. Many of them do multiple jobs, but I really do see an awakening in the state at all levels. And even people who have not been given a traditional title of world language support person are coming together because they see the value of communication. They understand the value of students learning not only about their own culture, but other cultures. And so even though we may not see it because it is not illuminated necessarily, there is an awakening that's happening in the state. And it's actually, to me, really exciting. I think we have a lot of work to do, and we need to get good information to more people. But that's why Texas World Language Radio exists.
No, and I commend, I know, Meredith, you have worked really hard to get this kind of coordinated, kind of as part of also as your love for advocacy for all of our students. And I was wondering, as you were even talking, is there a network of ESC people that are pooling? So I'm glad to hear that.
There is now.
Excellent. Well, see, that needs to happen.
It needed to happen.
Oh my goch, back in the
we're doing a book study.
Excellent. And back in the olden days, I did a something at the Region Service Center in Amarillo and at the one in San Angelo. And I think the only reason they had my name is because we had Maria Trevino at TEA. That was during her tenure, and they called her and said, who can we bring in? And I in terms of those way out, in the hinterlands and the maybe perhaps dark areas, that's something. Who do they contact if that's, see, they're not getting the letters from TEA that actually say this, right? If you're interested in blah blah blah. So and then the TEFLA and TALS, I am just so excited about the direction that that TEFLA is moving, and in the state and reaching out and kind of so I would love that to see if we had more types of those things. And TALS, I know, has a summer academy every other year for new supervisors. But even as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself, wow, shouldn't TALS have some kind of boot camp for curriculum people throughout the state who are not?
There's way more people who don't have a title than have a title.
And
so we got to reach everybody.
And capacity is so important. And I know a lot of times, and we've got examples in Frisco, I will just say, just in my experience with them, you get somebody in there that's really dedicated in terms of an evaluator, an assistant principal, a director of curriculum instruction who gets it, who's supportive, who's there. Well, they have, movement within those ranks too. So that assistant principal goes on, becomes a principal. Well, now you're not, right there evaluating, or the director of curriculum instruction moves to another, so that person then that comes in, number one, has to be willing to be re-educated.
Mm-hmm.
And then that re-education process on the importance of this needs to happen. So it's almost like you gain ground, but that person is successful and a leader, and then their career trajectory takes them other places. So, but in my mind, those principals move more to me, assistant principals, evaluators, there's a little bit more movement there than there might be with admin. However, I just think more work should be done. One of the things that I hear a lot is this idea of some kind of online basic course housed somewhere, even if it's housed at TEA, that folks can just access when they need it, that cover the bases.
Well, we have a couple of those courses at Region 10. So yes. Yeah, maybe we need to do a better job of sharing
something for evaluators.
Yeah.
Here's what you should see, something for directors of curriculum, because exactly, you've been really good about that, because but here's the deal, they need to know it. So this now comes back to TEA, someone there to say, hey, superintendent, if whoever's taking care of your world language people, here are 4 modules they need to watch.
Right.
And you can find them here.
Right.
That's interesting. I think we can frame this, and then Greta, I don't know how much you really reflect back on this. I'm sure you do a lot, but to see that, I mean, just all these things you're talking about here, there's still a ton of work to do. And it's cool to see that we have, support like through Region 10 and organizations like TALS and TEFLA. But I don't know if you ever envisioned this, if you go back to kind of those fateful days in Austin there and look at that. And I'm not saying these were the exact defining moments, but I can't tell you how appreciative I am. And I know Dr. Clark is too. And so many now that we have a curriculum where that focus is communication. It's not 4 or 5 different things. You have communication, and then you have culture that follows that up with 1B. And to have that direction and then define it even further as to what levels we're expecting students to communicate at, that's been such a guide that allows us to really have these conversations and allows us to really start to build these structures in our district or in these other organizations, and allows us to advocate for more money and allows us to do all these things. It's just awesome. And so I thanks so much for being our first guest today, and really all the work you've done with this. I can't tell you how appreciative I am for that.
Well, that means a lot. That means a lot. And I think there's 2 things in my career I'm the most proud of. One is pushing through certification for Chinese teachers. That was a huge task, and it took a lot of time, a lot of visits, a lot of phone calls. But I think once we got SBEC to give us a pathway for certification through ACTFL, through the OPI and the WL in the writing test, that's how now we have Vietnamese, we have all these other things. But the most thing I'm the most proud of are these TEKS, because I think that they put us on a professional footing. Right. I'm very proud of the committee and the work that we did. And honestly, I use our TEKS kind of secretly when I work over the United States, because so many states haven't taken this step forward. They still have the national standards, the world rating standards, which are good. But again, they're not operational. Does that make sense? That's my word.
Greta, I use the TEKS when I teach ESL on Saturdays, secretly using them.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to pull them out, this next week when I go other places, right? Because and I just say, this is what my students can do. And I just kind of work it in like that. And all the other little mini functions that you do, these are the macro functions. You can give an invitation, decline an invitation, invite someone to your birthday party, but those are micro functions, they're all there. And I'm just really, really proud of them. I'm proud of what all of y'all, what all of TALS, TEFLA is doing to push it forward. It really is life-changing for a teacher once they get it. So I appreciate y'all asking these questions, inviting me. I'm honored to be your first guest, and just really, really happy to sit back and watch this second, third wave of folks coming forward to push this out, because it's all for our students, right? That's
it
really
is.
Even kids who take 1 and 2 because they have to deserve. They are worthy of being able to hit that novice high level and being able to feel proud of the fact that they were able to do that. So I'm just really, really happy and pleased.
Dr. Clark, I think that's a wrap on episode 1. I don't think I could have put it any better. Any final thoughts?
Well, just final thoughts are, my heart is filled with gratitude for the TEKS, for the people who paved the way to provide them for us, and just really want to reiterate what Greta said, that it's not about us, it's about moving the needle for 5.4 million students in this state and growing. So thank goodness. Don't y'all love your TEKS just a little bit more now? So James, I think in episode 2, we're going to follow up with more information about the TEKS and dig into the next section, which is about our modes of communication.
And so for those of you listening, join us next time as we get into that and then start to look at those modes of communication. So for Dr. Clark and for Greta, our guest today, my name's James Ayers. And so until next time, let's move the needle forward, and we'll see you on Texas World Language Radio. Thanks for being with us.